Now this is the best, strongest, and easiest early leveling build for the Sorcerer in Season 4. This is a leveling build from level 1 to 40, or until you get to World Tier 3. I am using the Incinerate build, and the reason this build is so strong in the early levels is because you will not have any mana issues when leveling. When using the other core skills, you will run into mana issues in the early levels until you get better gear or legendary aspects. And you won't get good gear or legendary aspects until you are at least at World Tier 3. And you can get to World Tier 3 with this build once you're around level 36. Now I will have another build from level 40 to 70 that you can use once you get to World Tier 3 in another video. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you doing some Helltides, because doing Helltides is the best and fastest way for leveling. Now I am a lot higher level for using this build, but I'm just showcasing what this build can do. Now the main reason the Incinerate build is really strong in the early levels is because this skill does not use a lot of mana, and you can practically use this skill almost all the time. And you can use this build starting in World Tier 2, because the enemies are actually really weak in World Tier 2. So even though Incinerate is not the strongest skill, the enemies are just really weak in World Tier 2, making Incinerate really strong in the early levels. Now using the other core skills, you'll see you'll run out of mana really quickly and will have to use your basic skill a lot. And using Incinerate is a lot stronger than using your basic skills. Now once you get to World Tier 3, the enemies are a lot stronger, but at that time you will get better gear and legendary aspects that will help with your mana issues. So that's when you can switch out Incinerate for another skill. And I have a better build to use once you're at World Tier 3, and I will share that build in another video. Okay, so next let's check out the skills. Now the basic skill I'm using is Firebolt, and we're only going to use this skill if we run out of mana, and this skill does apply burning damage to enemies. The next skill I'm using is Incinerate, and this is our main damage dealing skill. And the great thing about this skill is it doesn't use a lot of mana, so you can technically use this skill almost all the time. The next skill I'm using is Frost Nova, and this skill is really useful because it will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies. The next skill I'm using is Hydra, and this skill does tons of damage, and you can have 2 Hydras on the field that will burn enemies. And the ultimate skill I'm using is Inferno, and this skill does huge burning damage that will pull enemies to the center of the Inferno. And while Inferno is active, your fire skills will cost no mana. And the last skill I'm using is Teleport, and this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. And by any chance, if you're crowd controlled, you can teleport to break free. Okay, so next for the enchantments. So the first enchantment slot you will unlock at level 15, and the second enchantment slot you will unlock at level 30. So for the first enchantment, I'm using the Hydra enchantment, and this enchantment will spawn a Hydra after spending 200 mana. And this enchantment is really good because having an extra Hydra will do a lot of damage to enemies. The next enchantment I'm using is the Frostbolt enchantment, and this enchantment is useful because your skills will apply chill to enemies, and applying chill to enemies will slow down the movement of the enemies, allowing you to burn enemies a lot longer before they reach you. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now first I do want to mention that I did leave 9 skill points out. The reason why is this is a build guide from level 1 to 40, and by at level 40 you should be at World Tier 3. When you hit World Tier 3, it's better to switch up your build because there will be other skills that are stronger than Incinerate. The only reason we're taking Incinerate in the very early levels is because in the early levels you will have mana issues, but Incinerate doesn't drain a lot of mana. But by the time you reach World Tier 3, you're gonna have the gear and legendary aspects where you can regain mana a lot easier. So in the very early levels, Incinerate will be the stronger skill because you can use Incinerate almost all the time. So first I did put 1 point into Firebolt, and this is the basic skill we are going to use that can also apply burning to enemies, and we will only use this skill if we run out of mana. Next I put 1 point into Frostbolt, and this is just for the Frostbolt enchantment. Now if you're not at least level 30 and you didn't unlock the second enchantment slot, then you can replace Frostbolt for enhanced Firebolt, so your Firebolt can pierce through burning enemies. But just be aware with this build, you're not going to use your basic skill a lot because you're going to use Incinerate more often. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into Incinerate, a point into Enhanced Incinerate, and a point into Destructive Incinerate. And this is our main damage dealing skill that'll do tons of burning damage to enemies. And like I mentioned before, this skill doesn't use a lot of mana, so you can technically use this skill almost all the time. Next I put 1 point into Devastation and 3 points into Elemental Dominance, and this skill will increase our core skills damage. Next for the defensive skills, I put 1 point point into teleport, a point into enhanced teleport, and a point into shimmering teleport. And this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. Next, I put 1 point into Frost Nova, a point into enhanced Frost Nova, and a point into mystical Frost Nova. And this skill will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies. And I do want to mention that in the very early levels, you don't need to take any barrier skills because the enemies are really weak, and it's better to just destroy the enemies a lot faster. Next, I put 1 point into elemental entombment, and this will give you a chance to reset one of your defensive skills. And next, I put 3 points into glass cannon, and this will greatly increase your damage, but in return you'll take more damage. Next, for the conjuration skills, I put 5 points into Hydra, a point into enhanced Hydra, and a point into summoned Hydra. And this skill does tons of burning damage, and you can have 2 Hydras on the field. Next, I put 1 point into align the elements and a point into mana shield, and these skills are really good to get damage reduction stats, which is a really rare stat to get. Next, for the mastery skills, I put 3 points into inner flames and 3 points into devouring blaze, and these skills will greatly increase the damage of our fire skills. And next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into inferno, a point into prime inferno, and a point into supreme inferno. And this is a really strong skill that does tons of burning damage. This skill will also pull enemies to the center of the inferno, and all your fire skills will cost no mana. Next, I put 1 point into fiery surge and 3 points into soul fire, and this skill will increase your fire skills damage. And with incinerate, you do stand still, so you will get double effect with this skill. And then I put 3 points into endless pyre, and this will greatly increase your burning damage. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into combustion, and this will greatly increase your burning damage, and you will get additional damage per unique source of burning damage you apply. Okay, so that's the whole skill tree layout at level 40, and I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now, I do want to mention the stats on your gear doesn't matter when you're leveling. You want to equip the gear with the higher item power level. So for example, this weapon has a plus green number, so it would be better to use this equipment and not care about the stats. The reason why is that when you're leveling, you're always going to find better equipment. But of course, once you get to World Tier 4 and start getting ancestral level gear, that's when you want to focus more on your stats. But there's one stat that I always look for on my boots and my amulet, and that one stat is movement speed. Having movement speed on your boots and having movement speed on your amulet will allow you to level up a lot quicker because you will be able to move through areas a lot faster. Now, with this build, you don't really need any legendary aspects for this build to work, but there are 2 legendary aspects you get really early in the season journey, and legendary aspects are a lot easier to get in season 4 compared to the other seasons. So the first legendary aspect that would be useful for this build is the flamethrower aspect, and this states Incinerate splits into 3 beams, each dealing 80% of normal damage, and this aspect is really strong on Incinerate, deal damage to huge groups of enemies. The next legendary aspect you're looking for is the incendiary aspect, and this states lucky hit. Damage from your pyromancy skills has up to a 25.5 chance to restore 10 mana, and this aspect is really helpful for not running out of mana when using Incinerate. But like I mentioned before, you don't really need any legendary aspects for this build to work. Now, any other legendary aspect is not really needed in the very early levels, and it's best just to use the gear with the higher item power level. And with this build, you don't really need to do any tampering to get to World Tier 3. And another thing I want to mention is that you always want to use a potion when leveling. The great thing about Season 4 is that you'll get tons of potions, especially right in the beginning of the game. And depending on what potion you're using, you're going to gain more experience compared to others. So if you're using a stronger potion, you will gain more experience compared to a weaker one. For example, this potion will give you an 8% increased experience, compared to this potion which will only give you a 5% increased experience. Okay, so thanks for checking out the best, strongest, and easiest sorcerer build for leveling from 1 to 40, or until you get to World Tier 3. With this build, you can start at World Tier 2 and dominate till you get to World Tier 3. And I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. And check out my other sorcerer build for level 40 to 70 next to continue a very easy leveling progression. Hope this helps and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,